The earliest account of this scene comes from Rurik, the co-author of the ballet's scenario. She will dance her last dance before the old men clad in bearskins, to show that the bear was man's ancestor. Then the graybeards dedicate the victim to the god Yarilo. A somewhat more detailed account comes from Stravinsky, published right at the time of the 1913 premiere. The young girls dance about the elect, a sort of glorification. Then comes the purification of the soil and the evocation of the ancestors. The ancestors gather around the elect, who begins the dance of consecration. When she is at the point of falling exhausted, the ancestors recognize it and glide toward her like rapacious monsters in order that she may not touch the ground. They pick her up and raise her toward heaven. The annual cycle of forces which are born again and which fall again into the bosom of nature is accomplished in its essential rhythms. This final, culminating scene is a wild dance of death, with generic sources in the Danse Macabre and in the operatic Mad scene. A woman, set apart from the others, expresses a range of wild desires for which she is crushed by patriarchal power sanctioned by religious tradition. The scene concludes the second cycle of expressive modes that is followed in each of the two parts of the ballet, from pastoral through military and religious to a wild dance. It also represents the closing of a dramatic and temporal circle. The ballet starts and ends just before daybreak, and this scene concludes a symbolic 24-hour day. It also concludes a symbolic year, from spring to spring. Musically, the Sacrificial Dance is rich in references to the opening scenes of the ballet. Usually in the spirit of radical transformation or demonic inversion, the musical materials of the pastoral opening return as essential components of this dance of death. The form of this scene is a sort of rondo, A-B-A-C-A. The formal return within the scene is related to a larger sense of return in the ballet as a whole. Return is the mark of the pastoral. The rite of spring begins and ends in springtime. In the preceding scenes, the chosen one was motionless, while first the young women and then the old men danced menacingly around her. Now the young women have departed and the old men sit in motionless judgment as she begins her dance. According to Bronislava Nijinsky's sister, who was supposed to dance the part, she makes a convulsive jump on one leg, having crossed and raised the other in front of her. Squeezing one hand into a fist, she threatens the heavens while the other hand is held close to her body. In Hodson's description of the Hodson-Nijinsky choreography, signature phrase, jump, 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 and then drop. The phrase is repeated with musical variations and elaborated gestures at crucial points throughout the solo. These continuous jumps are a test of endurance, and the drop is meant to express the physical and spiritual exhaustion of the ordeal. The three blocks that make up this section of the rondo make use of 10 different chords, which I number 1 through 10 on the otherwise unmarked score. These are arranged as 7 rotations, mostly beginning on chord 1, and at the end of each of the 3 blocks, ending 7, 8, 9, 10. Block 1 consists of 2 rotations. The chosen one's cry moves through a 0-2-4 frame, with one of its whole tones filled in chromatically. Although the 0-1-2-4 tetrachord is unusual in the Rite, The fact that it consists of 4 notes and is arranged in mostly descending order gives it a strong family resemblance to a large class of other melodies. The melody is related most obviously to the principal melody from Evocation of the Ancestors. The young woman's chant has become the chosen one's cry. Both of these melodies tap into the network of whole tones, 2-cycle, that has shaped much of Part 2 and will become even more prominent in the Sacrificial Dance. The Chosen One's cry extends whole tone 0 upward and completes it with its high E. It thus forms a culminating link in a chain of female-oriented tunes. Through fixed dyad voice leading, the Chosen One's cry is affiliated with another group of female-oriented tunes, including the Old Woman's tune from Augurs and the Snake Charmer tune from Ritual Action, 3 themes strongly associated with women and with the female. In a still more subtle way, the Chosen One's cry connects back to the opening melody of the ballet and to the feminized pastoral it represents. One can hear the Chosen One's cry as a near transposition of the opening melody up a whole step, from a melody centered on C to one centered on D, and with melodic shape, contour, almost exactly reproduced. This buttresses my argument that the Sacrificial Dance is a transformed repetition, a demonic parody of the opening scene. The feminized pastoral has become a wild dance of death. The harmony layer consists of just the D pedal in the bass. The big dissonant chords that accompany the melody are best thought of as planing of a particularly complex and intense kind. There are 2 separate planing strands, the top mostly triadic, the bottom mostly chromatic. The upper strand has triads and 7th chords that follow the melody around. The lower strand provides dissonant, percussive, semitone-intensive distractors. The first chord in this sequence is basically D7 with E flat supported by B flat as a semitone distractor. Thought of in that way, the chord evokes many earlier moments in the ballet, most conspicuously the Augurs chord, and the first chord in the introduction to Part 2. The connection with Augurs is particularly close. The principal harmony is on top, a 7th chord in 6/5 position. The semitone distractor is below. These 2 moments are related by transposition at T-1, projecting that lamenting interval over a very large span, and affirming a large-scale centric shift in the ballet from E flat in Part 1 to D in Part 2. The melody in the rest of the block arpeggiates up and down, D, F, A, F, D, and I'll call it the chosen one's fanfare. The strident accompaniment affirms the fanfare quality. As in the first part of the block, the planing accompaniment is in two strands, an upper strand that is mostly triadic, E-flat minor with distractors, and a lower strand that is entirely triadic, major triads whose roots trace a three cycle and are related by tritone or minor third. The chosen one's fanfare recalls fanfares and hunting calls from part 1. These melodies share an expressive mode, military fanfare, and an orientation toward DA as structural fifth. The chosen one has appropriated musical utterances associated with the young men in their most violent and militaristic moments. In the Sacrificial Dance, the fanfare has been transformed into an emblem of the chosen one's power as she struggles against her fate. In this section, the old men, previously seated around the circle while the chosen one danced, now begins to move slowly around the circle. Freimeuer relates their movements to a funeral march, but I would say it's more a slow religious procession, like other processions we have seen in spring rounds, for example. The musical representation of this procession consists of single big chords repeated incessantly and irregularly. While the old men move around the circle, some clad in bearskins, the chosen one alternately stands in place trembling and makes violent, sudden, and unsuccessful attempts to escape the circle and her fate. The musical representation of her wild movements is a descending three-note motive to a quintuplet rhythm, a compressed brass fanfare that I am calling the fatality motive, the musical emblem of her futile struggle against her fate. Block 4 is a harmony layer only, awaiting a melody. A single chord heard 18 times in the span of 29 eighth-note beats in irregular groups of beats separated by 1 eighth note of rest. This arrangement appears designed to thwart the sort of reduction in relation to regular hypermetrical prototypes that I have tried elsewhere. This non-progression of chords represents a primitive folk, men in a state of nature, whose lives are nasty, brutish, and short, and whose mental capacities are exceedingly limited, lacking in all subtlety and sophistication. The music represents these old men as murderous brutes who wear their religious observance as they wear their bearskins to menace and oppress. As for the chord itself, it is basically a stack of fifths, 0, 2, 5, 7, associated with the natural world and with the simplest sorts of musical formations, like the open strings of a violin, G, D, A, and E. To these four notes, an F is adjoined, creating the diatonic pentachord D, E, F, G, A. I'm thinking of the chord as rooted on D, with the bass G subposed beneath. In that view, the second section of the scene, like the first section, is centered on D. The chord can be related to the principal harmony from the religious procession at the center of spring rounds. Here, the affective link is clear. Both are religious processions with a dark, plodding, funerary quality. The relationship between them is further confirmation of a shift from E-flat centeredness in part 1 to D-centeredness in part 2. In block 5, the chord continues as before in its irregular groups separated by eighth note rests. Now, an important new melody is heard above it. The chord continues to sound in irregular groups of 1, 2, or 3, separated by eighth note rests. 12 chords positioned seemingly at random within a block that lasts for 20 eighth note beats. To this continuing harmonic layer, a powerful new melody is added, which I call the fertility motive, a descending major second filled in with the passing note. Played forte marcato by trombones and trumpets, it announces the imminent fate of the chosen one. In the Hodson-Nijinsky choreography, its statements coincide with frantic attempts by the chosen one to escape the circle and to escape her fate. The fatality motive recalls the sinuous counterpoint from the introduction to part 2, with a strikingly different character. Like its character, its contour is inverted, from a somewhat seductive chromatic ascent to a soul-destroying, ineluctable descent. Within the sacrificial dance, the fatality motive also represents a cyclic continuation of the chosen one's cry, the dramatic and musical extension of her increasingly frantic efforts to escape her fate. The fatality motive can also be related to melodies from early in part 1 associated with the old woman. The old woman's melody involved 2 minor thirds, one of which was filled in chromatically. The old woman's filled in minor third is compressed into the chosen one's filled in major second. The old woman has not been seen or heard since augurs early in part 1. This subtle evocation of her melody links the old woman and the chosen one as women struggling to survive an oppressive patriarchy, just as it links the sacrificial dance with the earliest scenes of the ballet. In block 6, the melody drops out and the chord continues as before, with its irregularly spaced groups separated by eighth note rests. In block 7, the harmony layer still has repeated chords in irregular groups, but the chord has been expanded. The fatality motive continues also, but transposed. The old men continue to circle and menace the chosen one. The principal chord, heard throughout with only brief embellishing deviations, is grounded in the perfect fifth DA. The chord has two components. On the bottom, a D minor triad, solidly rooted on D. On top, a familiar 6 plus 5 equals 11 arrangement that dissonates but does not seriously undermine the D minor triad below. The fatality motive is transposed down 4 semitones. These two melodies lie along the same whole tone scale, but there is a gap between them. Will the gap be filled? We will have to wait and see. At this transposition level, the fatality motive extends a whole tone network that moves through the sacrificial dance. In block 8, the chords thicken and intensify. The fatality motive is heard repeatedly, overlapping with itself. In block 8, the first statement of the fatality motive is a repeat from block 7, continuing the whole tone line from block 5. The second overlapped statement extends the line downward and opens up a new whole tone collection that is a 2 cycle. The main chord of this block is built on C sharp. We'll be going back to D in just a moment at the start of block 9, so this C sharp will turn out to be a large-scale neighbor. The chord is basically the familiar arrangement of a minor triad with a dissonant semitone distractor above its root. Like the other chords in the B section, block 9 consists of irregularly grouped chords with the fatality motive as the only melody. It ends with a cadential progression of 7 chords, concluding both the block and this portion of the B section. The melodic layer consists of 2 overlapped statements of the fatality motive right at the end of the block. The first of the 2, BA, lies within whole tone 1 and is related at T4 to its immediate predecessor, GF. The second of the 2, G sharp, F sharp, lies within whole tone 0. It repeats the previous 2 and is related at T-4 to the first fatality motive in the scene, C B flat. The main chord in the block is rooted on D. It is a virtual transposition of the main C-sharp based chord in the previous block. The neighbor note C-sharp has now moved back to the principal centric tone, D. Other than the deviation towards C-sharp in block 8, the entire scene thus far has been oriented toward D. One could also parse the chord as an amalgam of 3 triads, D major, D minor, and E flat minor. It thus evokes other similar moments earlier in the ballet in which D and D flat were juxtaposed. There is thus a strong harmonic link between the beginning and ending of Part 2, the introduction and the sacrificial dance. The 7-chord cadential progression leads from D minor to E major, more or less, with both the descending upper voice and the ascending bass encrusted with planing accompaniments that clash with each other. The first chord can be thought of as yet another clash of 2 triads with roots a semitone apart, specifically D, with triadic support, dissonated against E flat, which has its own triadic support. The progression is virtually identical to the progression of chords near the beginning of the introduction to Part 2. The compositional sketches show that Stravinsky wrote the progression in the Sacrificial Dance first, and then copied it into the introduction, thus planting a premonition. Part 2, like the ballet as a whole, thus involves a cyclic return at its conclusion. After the climactic cadential progression at the end of Block 9, Block 10 is a quiet return to Block 4 from the beginning of the B section. The music from Block 4 has been transposed down a whole tone. There is a harmony layer only, and the repeated chord is rooted on C. The transposition down a whole step continues in Block 11. This block transposes Block 5 down a whole tone. As the B section of the scene moves toward its close, we get a final set of entries of the fatality motive. At this new and final transposition level, it fills in a gap in the unfolding 2 cycle that spans the entire B section. This final statement of the fatality motive also extends a chain of descending 2s within whole tone 0 that extends back to the chosen one's cry at the beginning of the scene. Block 12 is the final block in the B section of the scene's A-B-A-C-A rondo form. The melody picks up the G sharp from the end of the final fatality motive in block 11 and gets stuck there, furiously elaborating it with neighbor notes. The principal chord in this block is rooted on F sharp. In the cadential progression that closes off the block and the larger formal section, that chord is projected up a tritone, roughly speaking, from F sharp to C. The section thus ends on C, concluding a large-scale progression of tonal centers that closely mirrors the chosen one's cry. The old men stop their pacing and seat themselves around the circle as the chosen one resumes her dance. The opening music of the entire A section returns, but transposed down a semitone. Blocks 13 through 15 repeat the opening blocks of the movement, transposed down a semitone. The opening blocks of the scene are transposed down a semitone. The first chord of the scene was centered on D, with E flat as a distractor. Here in blocks 13 through 15, the principal chord is centered on C sharp, with D, formerly the centric tone, now as a distractor. This transpositional gesture, T-1, resonates with many other such moves in the ballet, generally associated with mourning, grief, lament, sorrow, and tragedy. The transposition at T-1 has an effect on the chosen one's cry, positioning it within an unfolding whole tone network within whole tone 1, which it extends with the transposition up a whole tone. Apart from a brief return of the A section within Block 19 at its original pitch level, this section is the massive penultimate portion of this ABACA rondo form. The crowd of old men around the perimeter of the circle grows and becomes more active and menacing. The chosen one continues to struggle, evidently becoming more exhausted. The musical focus has shifted away from the chosen one and toward her tormentors. In Block 16, the only melodic event is a sustained D. In the next block, it will grow into an important melody. Meanwhile, this block establishes an ostinato that runs through the entire C section. The C-section ostinato has 5 distinct components, each lasting for 1 quarter note. Cumulatively, the ostinato projects a harmony based on E-flat, B-flat. In its conjunction of elements centered on E-flat and D, the music of the C-section recalls the opening of the Sacrificial Dance and, reaching back still earlier, the beginning of the introduction to Part 2. Looking ahead a bit, the ostinato harmony relates to the final chord of the ballet at T-1, another instance of a large-scale descending semitone, and another instance of motion from E-flat to D. In this block, the ostinato components occur in alternating groups of 5 and 3, conforming to the written meter, which alternates measures of 5/4 and 3/4. Later in the section, the groups become less regular and move out of phase with the written meter and the meter of the melodic line. In Block 17, the ostinato continues as before in alternating measures of 5/4 and 3/4. Above it, we hear an important new melody. This new melody is tritone-based, divided as 0, 2, 4, 6. It is sometimes extended into a complete whole tone scale, but its consistent core is the 4-note span A-flat, B-flat, C, D. I will call it the final judgment, the ultimate condemnation of the chosen one just prior to her final fatal dance. The final judgment is the culmination of the whole tone networks that move through the entire sacrificial dance. It represents a compressed summary of whole tone 0 activity between D and A flat. The final judgment has affinities and connections that reach beyond the sacrificial dance. Its upper dyad, CD, links it to a number of earlier melodies, all of which are associated in one way or another with the religious mode and its fatal judgments. More broadly, through fixed dyad voice leading, the final judgment brings together two sets of 0235 based melodies, those on ABCD and those on A flat, B flat, C flat, D flat, or G sharp, A sharp, B, C sharp. The ABCD melodies are mostly associated with the young women. The G sharp, A sharp, B, C sharp melodies are mostly associated with the sage and elders. The final judgment melody is a conjunction of the two, a judgment on one young woman by the old man. This block offers one more significant element, a punctuating chord. It directly recalls the principal chord of the Dance of the Earth at the end of Part 1. Within the Sacrificial Dance, it relates the final chord of the ballet at T2. It also relates in a more subtle way to the 5-beat ostinato it punctuates. Like the final judgment melody, this punctuating chord brings together a disparate group of earlier materials and looks ahead to the death of the chosen one, now only minutes away. In Block 18, the ostinato continues as before, and the final judgment recurs at the end of the block in its original 0246 form. Before the end of the block, however, we hear 4 statements of a compressed version of the final judgment melody, now filling the more common perfect fourth span as a familiar Dorian tetrachord 0235. The compression involves sliding one of the tune's whole tones, C-D, down by semitone to C flat, D flat. As a result, the compressed final judgment tune takes its place among the family of tunes generally associated with the sage, the elders, and the ancestors. Formally, Block 19 is only a brief interjection of A material within a more extended C section. But brief as it is, it reasserts D as a pitch center and restores the chosen one's cry to its original pitch level. After a brief interjection of the A material at its original pitch level on D, the E-flat-oriented ostinato resumes in Block 20. The final judgment is heard both in its 0235 and 0246 variants, the latter extended to a full whole tone collection. These blocks conclude the C section of the scene's rondo form. After this, we'll have only a reprise of the A section and the end of the ballet and the end of the chosen one's life. The principal event in these blocks is the final judgment, now back in its 0246 form, but transposed at T5. The whole tone networks we have been tracing through the sacrificial dance have mostly involved whole tone 0, but this transposition puts us squarely in whole tone 1 and creates various associations there. This final statement of the final judgment binds together earlier occurrences of the sentence of doom and the chosen one's cry. The final statement of the final judgment also creates strong links back to tunes from earlier in the ballet that are strongly associated with women's moments in the ballet, in the feminized pastoral, in their circle dances, in their entreaties to the warlike men. The final judgment is thus pronounced not only on the chosen one, but on women in general. In this concluding section of the sacrificial dance and of the ballet as a whole, the chosen one resumes her dance, her cry, and her fanfare with increasing intensity and wildness, culminating in her death. Her music is not at its original pitch level, as it might be in a pastoral scene, but transposed up a perfect fifth from D to A. At that level, it recalls and culminates musical events from earlier in the ballet, especially the opening scene. It is the end of a long journey, but also a symbolic return to its opening, the dark hour just before another dawn and the bursting forth of another spring. The whole of Block 22 is transposed up a perfect fifth from the opening block of the sacrificial dance. The transposition of the block relocates the chosen one's cry from CD to GA. At this, its final pitch level, the chosen one's cry completes the second of two large-scale traversals of whole tone 1. The transposition of the chosen one's cry also connects it to women's melodies from earlier in the ballet. The planing accompaniment to the melody traverses 7 rotations of a series of 4 chords. The first and last chords are both centered on A and are dissonated A7 chords with a crunchy G sharp A B flat in the lower strand. The harmony layer, consisting of nothing but a powerful alternation of A and C in the contrabasses, tuba, and timpani, affirms the acentricity of the block and strongly recalls the opening folk tune. This is the crux of my argument that the structure of the ballet is basically circular. The musical materials from the opening return at the end, but now in a radically different expressive mode, a demonic parody. At this transposition level, the chosen one's fanfare arpeggiates A minor, ACE, further affirming the acentricity of the block. Block 23 brings in more statements of the chosen one's cry. A and C continue to pound away in the bass, rooting this final section on A. This example starts 6 measures before the beginning of Block 23. In the planing accompaniment, the chosen one's cry is still harmonized by chords 1 through 4, as it has been all along. But the fanfare is harmonized with 5 additional chords. These new chords are all dominant 7th chords whose roots are 3 or 6 semitones apart, strongly recalling the octatonic festival of harmonies at the beginning of the ritual of abduction. The ritual of abduction was the scene of stylized violence by men against women. The final measures of the sacrificial dance have the same meaning, and the shared expressive impact is amplified by the shared musical contact. Starting back in Block 22, we get several additional rotations of the chord sequence. In Block 24, the pounding alternation of A and C continues in the bass. Above, in the thick melody layer, we hear 2 new melodies interspersed. The first new melody is a fanfare motive. It is related to and emerges from the chosen one's fanfare, but now it gives voice to the murderous crowd, and I'll call it the death fanfare. It starts as a single short fragment, but gradually expands to take over the entire musical texture and engulf the chosen one, extinguishing her and her music. It is extremely brutal and violent, fortissimo, marcato, sforzando, tutti. It is related by T3, more or less, to the chosen one's fanfare at its final pitch level, the AC relationship expressed in another way. And thus another link back to the folk tune at the opening of the ballet. However, that pastoral motive is now in the context of a murderous fanfare. Earlier in the ballet, fanfares were associated with the military mode, and more specifically with violence by men against women, as in the ritual of abduction. The same is true here. The death fanfare comes with a thick, plainy accompaniment in 2 strands. The upper strand is B-flat minor. The lower strand is the familiar octatonic brew of triads and dominant seventh chords whose roots are related by minor third or tritone. Closely related to the planing accompaniment for the chosen one's fanfare, but thicker and more dissonant. The second new melody in this block is the chosen one's final cry. It is played a few times softly by the horns and then disappears, eclipsed by the death fanfare. The melody emerges slowly, first 3 notes, then 4 notes, then 5 notes. In its 5-note form, the chosen one's final cry strongly recalls the first statement of the old woman's melody in the opening measures of the ballet. It is thus part of the intensive recall of the ballet's opening in its final moments. More specifically, it links the only 2 named female characters in the drama, the old woman and the chosen one. Like the death fanfare, the chosen one's final cry has a planing accompaniment. And also like the death fanfare, this planing accompaniment is based on dominant seventh chords whose roots are related by minor third and tritone, the same octatonic stew. Some of the chords have dissonant semitone distractors, but their basic outline is clear enough, as is the final reference to the ritual of abduction. In Block 25, the penultimate block of the ballet, the death fanfare is extended to 5 melody notes with 5 accompanying chords, and the block consists exclusively of 11 rotations of the usually 5-chord progression. As in the previous block, the chords that accompany the fanfares are in 2 strands, mostly B-flat minor in the upper strands, dominant 7th chords on E-flat, G-flat, and A in the lower strand. In the Hodson-Nijinsky choreography, the chosen one falls in the first measure of this final block, expires at the beginning of the second measure, then is lifted up by the old men as the final 2 chords ring out. There are 2 chords here at opposite ends of a ghastly trill and silence. The first chord is the combination of B-flat minor and C7 that comprise the first chord of the death fanfare. The second chord, the final chord of the ballet, returns to a focus on D. The arrival on D suggests a tonic return, a resolution of the long dominant on A. But I would prefer to emphasize the sense in which this climactic moment, the musical representation of the brutal ritual murder of a young woman, recalls the feminized pastoral opening of the ballet and the gentle folk melody quoted there. The circle of a 24-hour day, of a 4-season year, of the life of a young woman, and narrative arc of this ballet is now complete.